I'm reading from Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor E. Frankl, Part 1, Experiences in a Concentration Camp, Day 3. If men were required for an unpleasant and disliked job, the senior capo appeared and usually collected the men he needed from the back rows. These men had to march away to another, especially dreaded kind of work under the command of strange guards. Occasionally, the senior capo chose men from the first 5 rows just to catch those who tried to be clever. All protests and entreaties were silenced by a well-aimed kicks, and chosen victims were chased to the meeting place with shouts and blows. However, as long as my capo felt the need for pouring out his heart, this could not happen to me. I had a guaranteed place of honor next to him, but there was another advantage too. Like nearly all the camp inmates, I was suffering from edema. My legs were so swollen and the skin on them so tightly stretched that I could scarcely bend my knees. I had to leave my shoes unlaced in order to make them fit my swollen feet. There would not have been space for socks even if I had had any, so my partly bare feet were clothes always wet and my shoes always full of snow. This, of course, caused frostbite and chilblains. Every single step became real torture. Clumps of ice formed on our shoes during our marches over snow covered fields. Over and again, men slipped and those following behind stumbled on top of them. Then the column would stop for a moment, but not for long. One of the guards soon took action and worked over the men with the butt of his rifle to make them get up quickly. The more to the front of the column you were, the less often you were disturbed by having to stop and then make up for lost time by running on your painful feet. I was very happy to be the personally appointed physician to His Honor the Capo, and to march in the first row at an even pace as an additional payment for my services. I could be sure that as long as soup was being dealt out at lunchtime at our work site, he would, when my turn came, dip the ladle right to the bottom of the vat and fish out a few peas. This capo, a former army officer, even had the courage to whisper to the foreman whom I had quarreled with that he knew me to be an unusually good worker. That didn't help matters, but he nevertheless managed to save my life. One of the many times it was to be saved. The day after the episode with the foreman, he smuggled me into another work party. There were foremen who felt sorry for us, who did their best to ease our situation, at least at the building site, but even they kept on reminding us that an ordinary laborer did several times as much work as we did, and in a shorter time. But they did see reason if they were told that a normal workman did not live on a 10.5 ounces of bread theoretically. Actually, we often had less, and 1 3/4 pints of thin soup per day. That a normal laborer did not live under the mental stress we had to submit to, not having news of our families who had either been sent to another camp or gassed right away. That a normal workman was not threatened by death continuously, daily and hourly. Even I allowed myself to say once to a kindly foreman, if you could learn from me how to do a brain operation in a as short time as I am learning this road work from you, I would have great respect for you. And he grinned. Apathy, the main symptom of the second phase, was a necessary mechanism of self defense. Reality dimmed, and all efforts and all emotions were centered on one task, preserving one's own life and that of the other fellow. It was typical to hear the prisoners, while they were being herded back to the camp from their work sites in the evening, sigh with relief and say, well, another day is over. It can be readily understood that such a state of strain, coupled with the constant necessity of concentrating on the task of staying alive, forced the prisoner's inner life down to a primitive level. Several of my colleagues in camp who were trained in psychoanalysis often spoke of a regression in the camp inmate, a retreat to a more primitive form of mental life. His wishes and desires became obvious in his dreams. What did the prisoner dream about most frequently? Of bread, cake, cigarettes, and nice warm baths. The lack of having these simple desires satisfied led him to seek wish fulfillment in dreams. Whether these dreams did any good is another matter. Whether these dreams did, uh, the dreamer had to wake from them to the reality of camp life, and to the terrible contrast between that and his dream illusions. I shall never forget how I was roused one night by the groans of a fellow prisoner who threw himself about in his sleep, obviously having a horrible nightmare, since I had always been especially sorry for the people who suffered from the fearful dreams of deliria. I wanted to wake the poor man. Suddenly I drew back the hand which was ready to shake him. Frightened at the thing I was about to do, at that moment I became intensely conscious of the fact that no dream, no matter how horrible, could be as bad as the reality of the camp which surrounded us, and to which I was about to recall him. Because of the high degree of undernourishment which the prisoners suffered, it was natural that the desire for food was a major primitive instinct around which mental life centered. Let us observe the majority of prisoners when they happened to work near each other and were for once not closely watched, they would immediately start discussing food. One fellow would ask another working next to him in the ditch what his favorite dishes were. Then they would exchange recipes and plan the menu for the day when they would have a reunion, the day in a distant future when they would be liberated and returned home. They would go on and on, picturing it all in detail, until suddenly a warning was passed down the trench, usually in the form of a special password or number. The guard is coming. I always regarded the discussions about food as dangerous. It is not wrong to provoke the organism with such detailed and effective pictures of delicacies when it was somehow managed to adapt itself so to extremely small rations and low calories. Though it may afford momentary psychological relief, it is an illusion which psychologically surely must not be without danger. During the later part of our imprisonment, the daily ration consisted of very watery soup given out once daily, and the usual small bread ration. In addition to that, there was so called extra allowance, consisting of three-fourths of an ounce of margarine, or of a slice of poor quality sausage, or of a little piece of cheese, or a bit of synthetic honey, or a spoonful of watery jam, varying daily. In calories, this diet was absolutely inadequate, especially taking into consideration our heavy manual work and our constant exposure to the cold in inadequate clothing. The sick who were under special care, that is, those who were allowed to lie in the huts instead of leaving the camp for work, were even worse off. When the last layers of subcutaneous fat had vanished, and we looked like skeletons disguised with skin and rags, we could watch our bodies beginning to devour themselves. The organism digested its own protein, and the muscles disappeared. Then the body had no powers of resistance left. One after another, the members of the little community in our hut died. Each of us could calculate with fair accuracy whose turn would be next, and when his own would come. After many observations, we knew the symptoms well, which made the correctness of our prognosis quite certain. He won't last long, or this is the next one, we whispered to each other. And when, during our daily search for lice, we saw our own naked bodies in the evening, we thought alike, this body here, my body, is really a corpse already. What has become of me? I am but a small portion of a great mass of human flesh, of a mass behind a barbed wire, crowded into a few earthen huts, a mass of which daily a certain portion begins to rot, because it has become lifeless. I mentioned above how unavoidable were the thoughts about food and favorite dishes, which forced themselves into the consciousness of the prisoner. Whenever he had a moment to spare, perhaps it can be understood then that even the strongest of us was longing for the time, and when he would have fairly good food again, not for the sake of good food itself, but for the sake of knowing that the subhuman existence, which had made us unable to think of anything other than food, would at least cease. Those who have not gone through a similar experience can hardly conceive of the soul destroying mental conflict and clashes of willpower which a famished man experiences. They can hardly grasp what it means to stand digging in a trench. listening only for the siren to announce 9:30 or 10 a.m., the half-hour lunch interval when bread would be rationed out as long as it was still available, repeatedly asking the foreman, if he wasn't a disagreeable fellow, what the time was, and tenderly touching a piece of bread in one's coat pocket, first stroking it with frozen gloveless fingers, and then breaking off a crumb and putting it in one's mouth, and finally, with the last bit of willpower, pocketing it again, having promised oneself that morning to hold out till afternoon. We could hold endless debates on the sense and nonsense of certain methods of dealing with the small bread ration, which was given out only once daily during the latter part of our confinement. There were two schools of thought. One was in favor of eating up the ration immediately. This had the twofold advantage of satisfying the worst hunger pangs for a very short time, at least once a day, and of safeguarding against possible theft or loss of ration. The second group, which held with dividing the ration up, used different arguments. I finally joined their ranks. The most ghastly moment of the 24 hours of camp life was the awakening, when at a still nocturnal hour the three shrill blows of a whistle tore us pitilessly from our exhausted sleep and from the longings in our dreams. We then began the tussle with our wet shoes, into which we could scarcely force our feet, which were sore and swollen with edema, and there were the usual moans and groans about petty troubles, such as the snapping of wires, which replaced shoelaces. One morning I heard someone whom I knew to be brave and dignified cry like a child because he finally had to go to the snowy marching grounds on his bare feet, as his shoes were too shrunken for him to wear. In those ghastly minutes, I found a little bit of comfort, a small piece of bread which I drew out of my pocket and munched with absorbed delight. Undernourishment, besides being the cause of general preoccupation of food, probably also explains the fact that the sexual urge was generally absent. Apart from the initial effects of shock, this appears to be the only explanation of a phenomenon which psychologists was bound to observe in those all male camps, that as opposed to all other strictly male establishments, such as army barracks, there was little sexual perversion. Even in his dreams of the prisoner did not seem to concern himself with sex, although his frustrated emotions and his finer, higher feelings did find definite expressions in them. With the majority of the prisoners, the primitive life and the effort of having to concentrate on just saving one's skin led to a total disregard of anything not serving that purpose and explained the prisoner's complete lack of sentiment. This was brought home on my transfer from Auschwitz to a camp affiliated with Dachau. The train, which carried us about 2,000 prisoners, passed through Vienna. At about midnight, we passed one of the Viennese railway stations. The track was going to lead us past the street where I was born, past the house where I had lived many years of my life. In fact, until I was taken prisoner. There were 50 of us in the prison car, which had two small, barred peepholes. There was only enough room for one group to squat on the floor, while the others, who had to stand up for hours, crowded round the peepholes. Standing on tiptoe and looking past the others' heads through the bars of the window, I caught an eerie glimpse of my native town. We all felt more dead than alive since we thought that our transport was heading for the camp at Mauthausen, and that we had only 1 or 2 weeks to live. I had a distinct feeling that I saw the streets, the squares, and the houses of my childhood with the eyes of a dead man who had come back from another world and was looking down on a ghostly city. After hours of delay, the train left the station, and there was the street, my street. The young lads who had a number of years of camp life behind them, and for whom such a journey was a great event, stared attentively through the peephole. I began to beg them, to entreat them to let them stand in front of me for one moment only. I tried to explain how much a look through the window meant to me just then. My request was refused with rudeness and cynicism. You lived here all those years? Well, then you have seen quite enough already. In general, there was also a cultural hibernation in the camp. There were two exceptions to this: politics and religion. Politics were talked about everywhere in camp, almost continuously. The discussions were based chiefly on rumors, which were snapped up and passed around avidly. The rumors about the military situation were usually contradictory. They followed one another rapidly and succeeded only in making a contribution to the war of nerves that was waged in the minds of the prisoners. Many times, hopes for a speedy end to the war, which had been fanned by optimistic rumors, were disappointed. Some men lost all hope, but it was the incorrigible optimists who were the most irritating companions. The religious interests of the prisoners, as soon as it developed, was the most sincere imaginable. The depth and vigor of religious belief often surprised and moved a new arrival. Most impressive in this connection were improvised prayers or services in the corner of a hut or in the darkness of the locked cattle truck in which we were brought back from a distant worksite, tired, hungry, and frozen in our ragged clothing. In the winter and spring of 1945, there was an outbreak of typhus which infected nearly all the prisoners. The mortality was great among the weak who had to keep on with the hard work as long as they possibly could. The quarters for the sick were most inadequate. There were practically no medicines or attendants. Some of the symptoms of the disease were extremely disagreeable. An irrepressible aversion to even a scrap of food, which was an additional danger to life, and terrible attacks of delirium. The worst case of delirium was suffered by a friend of mine who thought that he was dying and wanted to pray. In his delirium, he could not find the words to do so. To avoid these attacks of delirium, I tried, as did many of the others, to keep awake for most of the night. For hours, I composed speeches in my mind. Eventually, I began to reconstruct the manuscript which I had lost in the disinfection chamber of Auschwitz, scribbled the key words in shorthand on tiny scraps of paper. Occasionally, a scientific debate developed in camp. Once I witnessed something I had never seen, even in normal life, although it lay somewhat near my own professional interests. A spiritualistic sense I had been invited to attend by the camp's chief doctor, also a prisoner, who knew that I was a specialist in psychiatry. The meeting took place in a small private room in the sick quarters. A small circle had gathered among them quite illegally, the warrant officer from the sanitation squad. One man began to invoke the spirits with a kind of prayer. The camp's clerk sat in front of the blank sheet of paper without any conscious intention of writing. During the next 10 minutes, after which time the seance was terminated because of the medium's failure to conjure the spirits to appear, his pencil slowly drew lines across the paper, forming quite legibly VAE V. It was asserted that the clerk had never learnt Latin and that he had never before heard the words Vae Victis, woe to the vanquished. In my opinion, he must have heard them once in his life without recollecting them, and they must have been available to the spirit of his subconscious mind, at the time a few months before our liberation and the end of the war. In spite of all the enforced physical and mental primitives of the life in a concentration camp, it was possible for the spiritual life to deepen. Sensitive people who were used to a rich intellectual life may have suffered much pain. They were often of a delicate constitution, but the damage to their inner selves were less. They were able to retreat from their terrible surroundings to a life of inner riches and spiritual freedom. Only in this way can one explain the apparent paradox that some prisoners of a less hardy makeup often seem to survive camp life better than did those of a robust nature. In order to make myself clear, I am forced to fall back on personal experiences. So let me tell what happened on those early mornings when we had to march to our work site. There were shouted commands: detachment, forward march, left 234, left 234, left A34, left 234. First man about, left and left, left and left, caps off. These words sound in my ears even now. At the order caps off, we passed the gate of the camp, and the searchlights were trained upon us. Whoever did not march smartly got a kick, and worse off was the man who, because of the cold, had pulled his cap back over his ears before permission was given. We stumbled on in the darkness over big stones through the large puddles along the one road leading from the camp. The accompanying guards kept shouting at us and driving us with the butts of their rifles. Anyone with very sore feet supported himself on his neighbor's arm. Hardly a word was spoken. The icy wind did not encourage talk. Hiding his mouth behind his upturned collar, the man marching next to me whispered suddenly, "If our wives could see us now, I do hope they are better off in their camps and I don't know what is happening to us." That brought thoughts of my own wife to mind. And as we stumbled on for miles, sipping on icy spots, supporting each other time and again, dragging one another up and onward, nothing was said. But we both knew each of us was thinking of his wife. Occasionally I looked at the sky, where the stars were fading and the pink light of the morning was beginning to spread behind a dark bank of clouds. But my mind clung to my wife's image, imagining it with an uncanny acuteness. I heard her answering me, saw her smile, her frank and encouraging look. Real or not, her look was then more luminous than the sun, which was beginning to rise. A thought transfixed me. For the first time in my life, I saw the truth as it is set into song by so many poets, proclaimed as the final wisdom by so many thinkers. The truth that love is the ultimate and the highest goal to which man can aspire. Then I grasped the meaning of the greatest secret that human poetry and human thought and belief have to impart. The salvation of man is through love and in love. I understood how a man who has nothing left in this world still may know bliss, be it only for a brief moment in the contemplation of his beloved. In a position of utter desolation, when man cannot express himself in positive action, when his only achievement may consist in enduring his sufferings in the right way, an honorable way, in such a position, man can, through loving contemplation of the image he carries of his beloved, achieve fulfillment. For the first time in my life, I was able to understand the meaning of the words, "The angels are lost in perpetual contemplation of an infinite glory." In front of me, a man stumbled, and those following him fell on top of him. The guard rushed over and used his whip on them all. Thus my thoughts were interrupted for a few minutes, but soon my soul found its way back from the prisoner's existence to another world, and I resumed talk with my loved one. I asked her questions, and she answered. She questioned me in return, and I answered. Stop. We had arrived at our work site. Everybody rushed into the dark hut in the hope of getting a fairly decent tool. Each prisoner got a spade or a pickaxe. Can't you hurry up, you pigs? Soon we had resumed the previous day's positions in the ditch. The frozen ground cracked under the point of the pickaxes, and the sparks flew, and men were silent, their brains numb. My mind still clung to the image of my wife. A thought crossed my mind. I didn't even know if she was still alive. I knew only one thing, which I have learned well by now. Love goes very far beyond the physical person of the beloved. It finds its deepest meaning in his spiritual being, his inner self, whether or not he is actually present, whether or not he is still alive at all, ceases somehow to be of importance. I did not know whether my wife was alive, and I had no means of finding out. During all my prison life, there was no outgoing or incoming mail, but at that moment it ceased to matter. There was no need for me to know. Nothing could touch the strength of my love, my thoughts, and the image of my beloved. Had I known then that my wife was dead, I think that I would still have given myself undisturbed by that knowledge to the contemplation of her image, and that my mental conversation with her would have been just as vivid and just as satisfying. Set me like a seal upon thy heart. Love is as strong as death. This intensification of inner life helped the prisoner find a refuge from the emptiness, desolation, and spiritual poverty of his existence. By letting him escape into the past, when given free rein, his imagination played with past events, often not important ones, but minor happenings and trifling things. His nostalgic memory glorified them, and they assumed a strange character. Their world and their existence seemed very distant, and the spirits reached out from them for them longingly. In my mind, I took bus rides, unlocked the front door of my apartment, answered my telephone, and switched on the electric lights. Our thoughts often centered on such details, and these memories could move on one to tears. As the inner life of the prisoner tended to become more intense, he also experienced the beauty of art and nature as never before. Under their influence, he sometimes even forgot his own frightful circumstances. If someone had seen our faces on the journey from Auschwitz to a Bavarian camp as we beheld the mountains of Salzburg with their summits glowing in the sunset through the little barred windows of the prison carriage, he would never have believed that those were the faces of men who had given up all hope of life and liberty. Despite the factor, or maybe because of it, we were carried away by nature's beauty, which we had missed for so long. In camp, too, a man might draw the attention of a comrade working next to him to a nice view of the setting sun shining through the tall trees of the Bavarian woods, as in the famous watercolor by Duer, the same woods in which we had built an enormous hidden munitions plant. One evening, when we were already resting on the floor of their hut, dead tired, soup bowls in hand, a fellow prisoner rushed in and asked us to run out to the assembly grounds and see the wonderful sunset. Standing outside, we saw sinister clouds glowing in the west and the whole sky alive with clouds ever changing shapes and colors. From steel blue to blood red, the desolate grey mud huts provided a sharp contrast, while the puddles on the muddy ground reflected the glowing sky. Then, after minutes of moving silence, one prisoner said to another, "How beautiful the world could be." Another time we were at work in a trench. The dawn was graying around. Grey was the sky above, grey the snow in the pale light of dawn, grey the rags in which my fellow prisoners were clad, and grey their faces. I was again conversing silently with my wife, and perhaps I was struggling to find the reason for my sufferings, my slow dying. In a last violent protest against the hopelessness of imminent death, I sensed my spirit piercing through the enveloping gloom. I felt it transcend that hopeless, meaningless world, and from somewhere I heard a victorious yes in answer to my question of the existence of an ultimate purpose. At that moment, a light was lit in a distant farmhouse, which stood on the horizon as if painted there, in the midst of the miserable grey of a dawning morning in Bavaria. It luxed in tenebris lucet, and the light shineth in the darkness. For hours I stood hacking on the icy ground. The guard passed by, insulting me, and once again I communed with my beloved. More and more I felt that she was present, that she was with me. I had the feeling that I was able to touch her, able to stretch out my hands and grasp her. The feeling was very strong. She was there. Then, at the very moment, a bird flew down silently and perched just in front of me, on the heap of soil which I had dug up from the ditch, and looked steadily at me. Earlier I mentioned art. Is there such a thing in a concentration camp? It rather depends on what one chooses to call art. A kind of cabaret was improvised from the time to time. A hut was cleared temporarily, a few wooden benches were pushed or nailed together, and a program was drawn up. In the evening, those who had fairly good positions in camp, the capos and the workers did not have to leave camp on distant marches. Assemble there, they came to have few laughs or perhaps to cry a little. Anyway, to forget. There were songs, poems, jokes, some with underlying satire regarding the camp. All were meant to help us forget, and they did help. The gatherings were so effective that a few ordinary prisoners went to see the cabaret, in spite of their fatigue, even though they missed their daily portion of food by going. During the half-hour lunch interval, when soup, which the contractors paid for and for which they did not spend much, was ladled out at our worksite, we were allowed to assemble in an unfinished engine room. On entering, everyone got a ladleful of watery soup. While we sipped it greedily, a prisoner climbed out onto a tub and sang Italian arias. We enjoyed the songs, and he was guaranteed a double helping of a soup, straight from the bottom, that meant with peas. Rewards were given in camp, not only for entertainment, but also for applause. I, for example, could have found protection, how lucky I was, never in need of it, from the camp's most dreaded capo, who for more than one good reason was known as the murderous capo. This is how it happened. One evening, I had the great honor of being invited again to the room where the spiritualistic seance had taken place. There were gathered the same intimate friends of the chief doctor, and most illegally the warrant officer from the sanitation squad was again present. The murderous capo entered the room by chance, and he was asked to recite one of his poems, which had become famous or infamous in camp. He did not need to be asked twice and quickly produced a kind of diary from which he began to read samples of his art. I bit my lips till they hurt in order to keep from laughing at one of his love poems, and very likely that saved my life, since I was also generous with my applause. My life might have been saved even had I been detailed to his working party, to which I had previously been assigned for one day, a day that was quite enough for me. It was useful anyway to be known to the murderous capo from a favorable angle, so I applauded as hard as I could. Generally speaking, of course, any pursuit of art in camp was somewhat grotesque. I would say that in real impression made by anything connected with art arose only from the ghost-like contrast between the performance and the background of the desolate camp life. I shall never forget how awake, awoke from deep sleep of exhaustion on my second night in Auschwitz, roused by music. The senior warden of the hut had some kind of celebration in his room, which was near the entrance of the hut. Tipsy voices bawled some hackneyed tunes. Suddenly there was a silence, and into the night a violin sang a desperately sad tango, an unusual tune not spoiled by frequent playing. The violin wept, and a part of me wept with it. For on that same day, someone had a 24th birthday. That someone lay in another part of the Auschwitz camp, possibly only a few hundred or 1,000 yards away, and yet completely out of reach. That someone was my wife.